Subaltern Speak, British Missionary Leper Hospitals in 19th-century Colonial India. My supervisor was Dr. Rhonda Semple. So I'm just going to start off by giving a definition of the term subaltern. So in this case, I am talking about the marginalized and oppressed groups in colonial India. Now everyone has their own image of leprosy when they hear that term. And the symptoms of leprosy is as equally varied as everyone's thoughts. Leprosy can affect the lungs and it can affect the skin, either as a rash or more commonly as the hardened skin. It can affect one's digits, so the encurled fingers and hands. It can affect the muscles, the cartilage, and the bones, which results in the typical leper face with the collapsed nose. So these symptoms are problematic because they don't only represent leprosy. For example, in tropical climates, the hardened skin could just be a result of sun exposure instead of as leprosy symptom. So, leprosy is a debilitating disease that has been around for several thousand years. It was treated as a lifelong disease until the mid-20th century when antibiotic intervention was created. But 70 years later, the growing incident of leprosy is coming around again due to social stigma and environmental realities. So people who present symptoms of the disease, especially in India, they don't go for treatment. And the World Health Organization had a study that showed that at the end of 2016, there were 173,000 cases globally, which was down from the more than 5,000 cases in the 1980s. However, it is steadily increasing. So examining the history of the disease in society is an important part of understanding and developing effective treatment globally. In 1858, the rule of India was transferred from the East India Company to the British government under Queen Victoria. And it remained under Britain until 1947 when it gained its independence as India and Pakistan. Under British reign, railways, canals, roads, and bridges were established as well as telegraph links, and this resulted in faster transportation, which allowed for raw materials such as cotton to be sent to ports for export to Britain. India was very financially important to Britain, and as such, it was in Britain's geopolitical strategy to take over the administration of India by the 18th century. Government of India transformed political life, laws, and regulations into a blend of indigenous customs and imperial needs, but those often benefited Britain. The formal institutions created to construct this imperial authority were, in almost all cases, reinforced through the action of informal attitudes and institutions that traveled throughout empire alongside the British military and administration. Most of history still tends to be recorded from the perspective of those who enjoy some degree of privilege. Historians tend to use records and read the works of those who mattered, reconstructing the past in the present. This is no different in colonial India regarding the British Protestant missions and the leper asylums they controlled. There were many gender assumptions in religious life, which resulted in ordained male missionaries being in charge of the asylums. So all of the sources that we have from that time are written in the Western male narrative. However, it is important to get a complete understanding and contextualization of events by looking at the subaltern groups present. Namely, in this instance, I am talking about British and Indian women, local workers, native children, and the leper patients themselves. Although historians began to appreciate the importance of subaltern history prior to the 1980s, including non-elite perspectives can be a challenge. Many subaltern histories were disregarded, unpreserved, or not even recorded, or in English, in favor of the Western narrative. Along the left here, you can see an image of a government report about sanitary conditions within a town in India. Unsurprisingly, it was written by a man and discusses a report that was made by another man as well. In colonial India, these dominating figures tended to be the British military, government, and religious figures. The military had formal and informal authority. The officers were the elites, and the soldiers were the non-elites. They were associated with the government and had concerns regarding vaccinations and health in India. they enforced vaccinations, which ended up benefiting the indigenous community, but it was for the benefit of their own British Army instead of the indigenous community. When Britain went overseas to India, a lot of their military ended up dying from disease, and so they decided this was a problem because the more who died, obviously their power would weaken, and then their control could be challenged. The government enforced segregation in the asylums through gender. And this was because at the time, the main belief was that leprosy was caused by genetics. So they wanted to prevent pregnancies. So it was for the greater good, you could argue. However, many married couples ended up being separated and not allowed to live together. The evangelicals were not from an elite position in society. They were from a moral position to advance God's work. They wanted to convert the Indian communities for their own good. They wanted to genuinely help the lepers build better lives by controlling, managing, and healing their disease. However, these actions were based on historical religious understanding of a leprosy disease from the Bible, where lepers are sinners. They saw individuals through this lens against a similarly judgmental evaluation of non-Western culture. Missionaries were able to increase interest and donations by proving successful conversions and improving the lives of lepers. However, it can't be said that the missionaries acted simply for their own benefits. Across the 19th century, as education and professionalization replaced personal connections between elites, evidence exists of a balance. Missionaries might like to convert locals, but it is also possible to see a shift from the focus on sin and towards an acknowledgement that lepers had human needs. That this is in no way a straightforward process, as the following case study illustrates. In 1893, at the Madras Leper Hospital, there was a surgeon named William Judson Van Someren. He aimed to determine if the disease was inherited or transmitted by some agent. He had 13 married leper patients under his care, and between all of those couples, there were 46 children. He studied all of those children, and none of them had any signs of the disease. He then studied the parents of the leper patients, and none of them had symptoms of the disease either. Therefore, he provided a case study disproving the hereditary nature of the disease. This was an exciting outcome that allowed a missionary doctor to engage in the international world of medical discovery. However, it had a kinder application as well, since it proved that a married couple could live together and procreate without passing on the disease. Not all of the leper patients required the dominant voices to speak for them. Some made attempts to have their own voices heard. In 1873, Van Someren suggested to the Madras Leper Hospital to enforce light labor on the leper patients. It was kind of justified, you could see. He wanted to prevent costs for the hospital, and he wanted to keep the patients occupied so that they weren't being idle, so that they would be more physically and spiritually fit. However, out of the 68 patients approached, 43 refused. The hospital went back and threatened to restrict their rations. So the patients banded together and went to the town police and had their case heard in front of the magistrate. Unsurprisingly, the magistrate sided with the hospital. However, the patients actually accepted this verdict. They just wanted to have the opportunity to exercise their right to be heard. Gender had an interesting role in the disease. Women were responded to typically with more sympathy than their male counterparts. The genders used various methods to have control over the disease. So, like I said before, one of the main symptoms of the disease is the curled fingers and hands. The women would use their hands to portray distress and timidity, which reinforced proper feminine societal expectations. So since they had leprosy, there would be no marriage prospects for them. So they relied on charitable givings for their livelihood. However, the men would use their hands to shake them aggressively, which created the portrayal of the, quote, lecherous and licentious leper to the greater population. This is important because we must get at these gender expectations. Their actions are reinforcing gender stereotypes, but it is also because of these stereotypes that we interpret their actions as such. In the picture here, you can see how the lepers are all showing their hands, clearly having been instructed to. But why would they show their hands? Hands are central to what you do, whether it's physical labor or anything else. So by showing their hands, it's a marker of disability and the disease's progression. So since the skin gets hardened, you won't notice if you get a cut because of the damage to the nerve endings. So then if you don't notice the cuts or the nicks, it's more likely to get infected and you're more likely to lose the limbs. That's why a lot of them lose their hands and their feet, because those are the limbs that are most used. We don't have the children's voices. However, the missionary women report the kids and parents being sad from the segregations. This is important because there is no official record on how they felt. But since there are no conclusive records, it is open to interpretation. It's possible that missionaries, especially the women missionaries, were more sympathetic to the mothers and the children's due to the motherhood value in British society. However, many upper middle class families did send their children away for education for the greater good of the child, so it's possible that it became a matter of what is necessary rather than what the family wants. Thus, it is not possible to come to a direct conclusion. From a historiographical perspective, these children could grow up and write about their childhood as adults. This transcription written across time can change how a person remembers the past. However, it is still valuable because it still contains the perspective of that person's childhood, just removed from the event. Then on the picture on the right here, you see a Christian indigenous mission worker caring for orphans. So leprosy patients were not silent and they were not powerless. A variety of historical sources make it possible to see how mission workers increasingly listened to the social and cultural needs of the community and how the patient community advocated on its own behalf. The imperial interface was full of complex realities. However, it is important to work through these realities to gain a full understanding and contextualization of the implications British influence had on the Indian leper and society. The real shift is in what these voices bring. Throughout my thesis, I had addressed a methodological argument that in order to have a complete story, one must consider a bottom-up historical approach. The thesis also addresses that missionaries were not merely saviors, but sometimes chose to, and sometimes were forced to, listen to their leper communities. Finally, the thesis argues that Western medicine was effective when used with indigenous medical notions of illness, and that the notion is mandatory to promote successful treatment even today. Thank you.